Mona Alami. She joins us from Beirut. She is a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council think tank. Thanks so much for speaking to us, Mona. I mean, what does the death of al-Baghdadi mean from your perspective? Should there be a sense of relief now?
I think it's more symbolic than strategic. I think that the end of Baghdadi in such a humiliating way, ends a big chapter in jihadism. Definitely, for the last year or so, or 2 years or so, most ISIS cells that are operating in Syria and Iraq have been operating in a decentralized manner. So basically, Baghdadi did not really have any control of what was going on in terms of the ISIS insurgency. However, I do think that Baghdadi's death will mean more possibly discussions or infighting between the various ISIS cells in terms of who will replace Baghdadi. And there are also a lot of question marks about the death of Baghdadi, of how he died in Idlib, in an area and actually in a house that was owned by a commander of Haras al-Din, who was also a commander within an organization that was an Al-Qaeda affiliate.
Let me ask you this, just to see if we can put it into a different perspective here. I mean, how would you compare the death, for example, of Osama bin Laden? We may hear less about Al-Qaeda now, but the organization still does exist today. Do you imagine Daesh will continue along those same lines without al-Baghdadi as its head?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. What matters here is when we look at the evolution of Al-Qaeda, we saw that after the death of its leader, we saw that Al-Qaeda became more and more localized and decentralized and was able of using the upheaval that was triggered by the Arab Spring to create structures that were very localized and with very local identity. We saw that with the Nusra Front in Syria as an example, Akab, Akim, and in other areas around the world. ISIS, from the creation of the caliphate, operated in a very global, operated really as a global enterprise. And I do think that the death of Baghdadi announces this new chapter in the devolution of ISIS in more localized organizations that will be operating the various former wilayat.
Okay.
However, I just think it's very interesting to look at Baghdadi in the context of the new protests that are taking place in the Middle East. We're seeing that in Lebanon, in Iraq. We've seen that in Jordan, and we've seen that so far jihadists, unlike during the first wave of protests of the Arab Spring, have not been able to capitalize on this movement, because we've seen also that ISIS, for example, in Iraq and Syria, has lost the Sunni support it previously had because of its many defeats and the destruction it created in the region.
Right. You had spoken a little bit about a potential successor in your first answer there. I'm a little more curious about that because, at least in the case of Al-Qaeda, as we were speaking about, we knew what the hierarchy was. We knew there was not just one leader at the top. There were others directly in line behind him. It doesn't seem Daesh really has that same hierarchical structure, does it not?
Yeah, it's also an important point. We've seen that the US-led anti-ISIS coalition has been able to kill and defeat a lot of the first, second, and third, even third-rank commanders in Syria and Iraq. In August 2019, Baghdadi announced a possible replacement. His name is Abdullah Qardash. He's an Iraqi from Tal Afar. However, there is also a debate on a possible replacement by Baghdadi by non-Iraqi figures, given the, the killing of all these important leaders. Several names have been so far mentioned, such as Abu Saleh al-Jazrawi and Abu Uthman al-Tunisi. However, in the case of Abu Saleh al-Jazrawi, Al-Hayat reported in 2015 that he had been killed in Syria. So it's very unclear on if a possible, more Arab or internationalized leadership will take over ISIS.
Mona Alami, thank you so much for joining us there live from Beirut. We appreciate it.